Hello, Professor Hildebrandt here. This is the first of a three-part lecture series for Chapter 7 from our McEachern textbook. This chapter covers unemployment and then inflation. I am going to break the topic of unemployment up into two lectures, and then the third lecture will focus on the topic of inflation. So let's get started. So this takes us back to an earlier chapter. We talked about the business cycle, okay, how there's these natural ups and downs to our macroeconomic activity. And so you can see here we have a curve for real GDP, and so it's increasing. We reach what's called a peak. And then we have a period of contraction. So real GDP is decreasing, and then we reach this bottom point that we call a trough, okay? But what we're looking for is a long-term growth trend, so a positive growth trend, which is what we have seen in the United States. So that's what a business cycle is, going from one peak to the next. And within that business cycle, again, there would be a recessionary period, right? A contraction. Okay, and so that's what this is showing. And then the expansionary period would follow that. And so the red here represents the recession, and the green period there represents the expansionary period, or we had positive economic growth. Now you're probably thinking, well, how does this relate to unemployment? Okay, so during the recession, the red area, we would see in our economy an increase in unemployment. People who don't have jobs but are actively looking for work, okay? And we'll talk more about that definition of unemployment here in a moment. And then we'll see the opposite happen in terms of unemployment when we are in an expansionary period. So we'll actually see a decrease in the rate of unemployment. Notice it does say here, and we'll talk more about this later, but there is a lag between the this part of the business cycle that we're in and what we see happening with our unemployment rate. So let's talk more about this and what does it mean to be unemployed? Okay, well, there's a few things. You're not working. Okay, that one's pretty intuitive. Willing and able. So it's not just that you're not working, right? I have 3 girls, ages 10, 5, and 3. Guess what? They're not working. But they doesn't mean they're unemployed, because they're also not willing and able to work, right? They're young children. Oh, but here's another kicker. You're not working, but you're willing and able to work. Maybe like my granddad, right? He's not working. He is willing to work if he had to. He's still able, even though he's older, right? But we don't classify my granddad as unemployed either. Why not? Because he's not actively seeking a job. My granddad's retired. So, and specifically, to be calculated as truly unemployed, you have to have been actively seeking a job recently, within the past month. So who's employed, who would be employed? A person is counted as employed if they're working. It can be full-time or even part-time. You are still employed. It can be a temporary job. So it can be, doing retail sales during Christmas, working as a lifeguard at a swimming pool during the summer. If you have a job, but you're on vacation or using some sick leave, maternity leave, etc., you are still counted as employed. Now, here's a term that you may have heard before, but not quite understand the true definition. But this is really important to understand. So what is the labor force? Okay. Well, the labor force is a group comprised of 2 different classifications of individuals. The first, those that we just defined as employed, but the labor force also includes those who are, by that strict definition, unemployed. So again, not working, yet willing and able to work and actively seeking employment. Okay, so that's who the labor force is. So let's break this down. So we define the labor force as the civilian, non-institutional adult population. Let's break down this definition. Using the word civilian means that we're only counting those that are not serving in our armed forces, so are not in the military. So people in the military actually don't count as part of our labor force calculations. I'm not really going to get into why that is, but that's how we define it. Adult, okay, non-institutional, so let's define these pieces. So non-institutional down here, this means they're not in prison or a mental facility or a home for elderly or disabled individuals. Okay, that's what the non-institutional part of the definition means. Adult, it is kind of interesting here in the United States because we define this a lot of different ways, right? 18 to vote or join the military, 21 to purchase and consume alcohol, right? Well, here for the labor force, we define adult as 16 or older, okay? So again, it's the civilian, non-institutional adult population who's working or looking for work. So again, we have those two pieces here of the labor force. You're employed either full-time or part-time. And number two, you're unemployed but looking for a job. So we do have some groups of people who are simply not in the labor force. I've already mentioned a couple, but there's more. So students, if you're a full-time student, then you don't count in the labor force calculations. My grandparents, right, they're retirees. My husband actually stayed at home for a while with our oldest daughter for almost a year, okay? And so while he was with her, he was not in the labor force. The ill and disabled, prisoners, mental hospitals, military. So we talked about those. And then the kids, right? Those who are 15 and under don't count as part of our labor force. So here's kind of a little flow chart that I made to try to figure out how these groups all fit together. So we start here over in the red on the left-hand side of our screen with the entire adult population. And then we break the adult population into two groups, those who were in the labor force and those who are not. So let's go down this top line or branch first, looking at those in the blue box who are part of the labor force. Well, again, we then divide the labor force into two groups, working or looking for work, right? Well, if you're working, you're either working full-time or part-time, but either way, you count as working and you count as part of the labor force. Now, if you're looking for work, then this is the one group, and this is why I like this flow chart, because this is the only group that we count as unemployed. Later on, I'm going to ask you guys to calculate an unemployment rate, and y'all are going to try to include all these different groups of people, but you cannot. The only group that is counted as unemployed are those who are not working but willing and able and actively seeking employment. So this group right here in this blue box. Now, those down here in the orange who aren't in the labor force could be because they are one of those groups we talked about, students, retirees, military, or parents. Haven't yet mentioned yet, discouraged workers. So I'll talk more about them in a minute, but basically a discouraged worker, they've given up. So at one point, they were unemployed, but they moved from being unemployed to a discouraged worker when they quit seeking a job. So more on them in a moment. So here is the United States broken down by the labor force and those not in the labor force back in February of 2017. So this blue circle over here are everyone that's in the labor force. So we had 160 million. And again, there were two groups in that 160, 152.5 million were employed, but then the second group, 7.5 million were unemployed, okay? And then this green circle represents those who are not working, and it was 101.7 million. And it's, again, got two groups. The majority of those are because they do not want to work for some reason, okay? So, or their children, right? They're simply one of those classifications that are not in the labor force. But those unemployed 7.5 million are also not working. And so that's why our two circles here have this crossover section. The unemployed are both in the labor force, but they are also not currently working. All right, so we're going to have a couple of formulas here for some things that you guys are going to calculate. And here's our first one. It's the labor force participation rate. And what this is showing is out of our adult population, how many people are in the labor force? And so here's your formula. You take the total number of people in the labor force. And remember, there's two groups, the employed, those that are working, and the unemployed, those who are looking for work. So we take that number, that's our labor force, and we divide that by the total adult population. Sometimes you'll also see me call it the total relevant population. And that's because I could ask you to find a specific labor force, like find the labor force participation rate for women, or find the labor force participation rate for people in the United States over the age of 40. And so we would then, instead of dividing by the total adult population, we would divide by the total number of adults over 40 in the United States. It is going to be a rate, and so we then multiply that number by 100. Okay, so let's look at some graphs here that show how the labor force participation rate has changed over time. So this first graph we're looking at here is for men, and we have broken them down into these different age groups, okay? 25 to 29, 30 to 34, so on and so forth until we get up to 50 to 54. And we're starting all the way back here on the left in January of 1976 and taking it more to current day on the right, January 2016. The blue bars that you see in this graph represent periods of recessions, okay? So we had contractionary periods throughout these several decades. So overall, we can see some trends. So the main trend for men in general, regardless of your age, is actually lower labor force participation rates, right? When we started in 1976, the range of participation, depending on age groups, was from about 91% all the way up to 97%. So almost all men who lived in the United States were part of the labor force, okay? Those are really high numbers. Now, when we get closer down here to 2016, and we look at this range of participation, it drops down to about 83.5% up to about 93%. Again, varying by age groups. And it shouldn't surprise anyone, the older age group, they do have the lower participation throughout all of the decades, okay? We also do see, if we were to zoom in a little bit on during these recessionary periods, we do, for the most part, see a drop in labor force participation during those times. Now, I want you to keep in mind the left-hand side over here, the range, because I'm about to show you the other half of the population, the women, and it's going to be a lot different. So notice here, though, this zoomed in graph that we're looking at started at 80% participation up to 100, because that'll be important here in 1 second. Because here's our ladies, right? And so you might be thinking, wow, they're at 100%. But notice here, our range is starting at 50%, going up to only 80%, okay? But the graphs do look a lot different, right? The guys were all going down like this, right, basically. And we see the opposite for the women's. Why? Because as we've moved through the mid to late 70s towards present day, we have continuously, regardless of the age group, seen an increase in labor force participation rates for women. Okay, and so it's been that way for all of them. Again, during recessions, not always, but we typically do see some decreases. And another thing I think that is interesting for the women is there's much less spread regardless of the age breakdown when we look at labor force participation rates moving us closer to present day, right? Our range here is like 73 to 75%. So all of the age groups are kind of clustered really closely together. And that was another difference we saw between the men and the women. So let's talk about the unemployment rates. We talked about labor force participation rate, but the second measure that we're going to use in this chapter is the rate of unemployment. And so each month, the BLS, which stands for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is going to report some things out, like the size of the labor force, the number of the employed, and the number of the unemployed, which brings us then to your next formula for this chapter, the unemployment rate. So to calculate your unemployment rate, you're going to take the total number of unemployed and divide that by the labor force. Again, remembering that your labor force should be comprised of two groups, both the employed and the unemployed. So whereas the labor force participation rate is showing us the percentage out of all of our adults in the U.S. who are part of the labor force, here the unemployment rate shows what percentage of the labor force is currently not working. And again, because it's a rate, we are multiplying that number by 100. So here we go, showing a change in monthly unemployment rate from 1948 through 2017. Okay, and so you can see we had periods where it was much higher. Early 80s, right? We got over 10%. Unemployment. In the Great Recession, back in 2008, 2009, we again hit the 10% mark for unemployment. And then you can see, though, unemployment has recovered nicely. And more recently, we were looking at unemployment under 3%. So really low unemployment going on pre-pandemic. Okay, so that's it for this first section of Chapter 7. Stay tuned. Make sure you catch the next lecture where I will finish talking about the topic of unemployment, and then the third where I cover inflation. Thanks, guys.